What's going on, guys? RibombeeTeacher in the house, and this is gonna be the hardest video I have ever done and will ever do in my entire YouTube career. And some of the things that I'm gonna talk about in this video are gonna be very sensitive, very dark, very difficult for me to talk about. But I think it's time that I break my silence, because for 28 and a half years I haven't been what I wanted to be. We haven't got to where we wanted to get to, at least in my own eyes. But usually at the end of each month I like to do Ask Ribombee, where you guys ask me questions and I answer them. But I wanted to take this time at the end of 2020 to tell you guys my story. From when I was born in 1992 to right now. And it's gonna be emotional. It's gonna be hard. But this needs to happen. Because every time I hear people talk highly of me, people praise me, people support me, I sometimes feel like I'm being disingenuous. Because, yes, while I'm on stream, I'm upbeat, I'm energetic, I'm sarcastic, I mess around with you guys, and it's great fun. But I want you guys to know, not just RibombeeTeacher, the streamer, but Mark, the RibombeeTeacher, the guy behind the streamer. So, let's start from the beginning, shall we? So, back in 1992, I was born to mom, dad, older sister, 7 years older. And to many, that seems perfectly normal. However, that was not the case with me and my family. My family was very dysfunctional. There was a lot of domestic issues, from violence to verbal abuse to even medical abuse at times. Lot of medication being misused. Lots of issues surrounding the family. So of course, being a young boy being brought into that family is not a good thing. Okay, it meant that the start to life that I had was not conducive to being what some might consider normal. And as we move forward, even just a couple of years, you know, things were not right at home. Both of my parents were unemployed. My father was on disability benefits. My mother was technically his full-time carer. But there wasn't money in the household. And any money that was in the household was spent on the parents. And us as kids, myself, my older sister, we largely fended for ourselves. And for a lot of that period, there was a lot of bickering. A lot of the time it was between parents. Sometimes it was parents, older sister. And a lot of the time it was even me. Just a young kid, you know, a couple of years old. Able to walk and talk relatively early. But had no idea what was going on around and would sometimes even get caught in the crosshair. And because of all the fighting and everything that became normal, that's all I ever knew. And, you know, when we go back to 4 years old, when I start preschool, you know, that was like my only ever interaction I had with other children my age. You know, I only had my older sister, who used to do a lot of things to me that I didn't like. It's kind of hard for me to talk about it, so I'm gonna try and be as honest as possible, but there may be some things I skip out because I find too hard. But back then, when I started school, you know, a child would poke me or just try to get my attention and I'd hit them. And I didn't know what I was doing wrong because, of course, the teacher would tell me off, the other kid was crying, and I didn't understand. And it meant that I got in trouble all the time at school. And of course, eventually it became common that they invited my parents in. And of course, my parents being the parents that they were, and I didn't know this at the time, they acted all sweet and innocent. Oh no, he's not like this at home or anything like that. But now looking back on it, I think even my preschool teachers noticed that something was wrong. But nothing ever really was done about it. And after the first time that my parents were called in, we all went home, and my parents started beating me. I was 4 years old, and it would not always just be hands. It would be like bottles. Sometimes it would be like physical objects. Sometimes they would just like push me against the wall. You know, but it would really hurt. And of course, I would cry because I was in pain, and then I would just be locked in my room. And even then, like, my room was next to my parents' bedroom, and that meant that whenever they were arguing or whatever, it was literally just the other side of the wall, and it would keep me awake. So I never really slept. I couldn't sleep at all during that time, and I think a lot of people realized, especially at school, particularly among staff, that there was a lot of issues. But we move into starting main school at 5 years old, and everyone was terrified of me. Schools didn't know what to do with me. I was put in schools for quite a while. I was never allowed outside at break or lunchtime or anything like that. I was just forced to sit inside. And it really felt painful to me, because it meant that I never had any social development at all. I was just a violent kid that was always in trouble, and you know, there were times when I would get not suspended necessarily, but what we call internally excluded, which was meant that I was just locked away and I had to do everything by myself throughout the day. And back then I couldn't read or write at all. I could do numbers really well. I was good at numbers, but my reading was awful. And it made me realize that I wasn't like a lot of the other kids. You know, I was aggressive, I hurt people, and I was hurting myself too. And that was when I started getting what felt like really, really bad headaches a lot of the time. But they were kind of just ignored for a long time, even if I would complain about them, because it was me. And I think even people at school started thinking I was just making excuses, but no, it was generally the case. I was just getting major headaches constantly. And it hurt. And because it hurt, I started going into a meltdown, and I'd lost all emotional control. And at that point, this was when I finally got assessed for certain health issues. One of the things that I was assessed for was a sleeping disorder, which bizarrely enough came up negative at the time at first, but I got retested and then diagnosed with insomnia. But that was obviously due to the fact that I wasn't sleeping, because I had not really slept at all, so my body was kind of conditioned to just run on air. And then they were testing me for Asperger's syndrome, which I came up negative for. But one of the things that they realized was that I had no, like, social development. And that was when I was taken to what I now know as a psychologist. I didn't know who they were at the time. And they ran me through a bunch of assessments and stuff. They asked me questions. They would put me in, like, these scenarios and stuff like that. And that was the first time, really, that it became known that I had an attachment disorder. And that attachment disorder meant that I was not able to, like, form friendships with anyone because I just didn't know how. And not knowing kind of made it worse because even at school, like, I'd be told off all the time for doing something in class, or, you know, I'd hit someone or whatever. And I always remember when I was, let's see, 7 years old at the time, we had a new girl in our class. She joined us from another school, and on her first day, nobody, of course, really told her what was going on, and knew that, there was an issue. So, obviously, she tried to get my attention, because she was going to ask me for, like, a pencil sharpener that was on our desk at the time, and I turned around and hit her in the face, because he'd caught me completely unawares. She touched me from behind, and I ended up breaking her nose. And I felt awful, because I had realized what I'd done, and I just cried. And I just remember just sitting in the corner of the room with my head buried in my hands and just wailing out. And because, of course, it meant that was when I realized that I was, like, a monster. And I still call myself that now sometimes. And we start going a lot further through school. I've been in a few years now. And it was considered the possibility of me moving to a special needs school. Now, my parents vehemently denied that there was anything wrong with me, despite any medical assessment that was presented to them or anything like that. They would always just deny that there wasn't anything wrong. They didn't care. And obviously, like, anything that was told to my parents, like, was just meant that I was beaten again and again at home. I would have, like, handprints and scars and various other things all over me with what was going on. And it would suck. And obviously I would go into school, end up in another fight, end up with more marks on me, and it's just such a vicious cycle of destruction, to the point where I hated myself. And at 10 years old, I hated myself so much. I took a knife out from the kitchen at home. I put it in the bottom of my bag. And during school, I ran out. And I ran out of school. And I went down to the local park. And in that local park was a lake. And I just remember at the time, it was, like, really quiet. At the lake, there wasn't anybody there. There was barely anybody around. And I went to the edge of the lake. And I took the knife out of my bag. And I held it to my neck. And I held it there for a while. Just saying, this is what I deserve. This is all I deserved. Nobody cared about me. Nobody wanted to know me. I was just nothing. And as hard as it was, I just could not drive that knife into my neck. And eventually a police car had come past and had seen this kid with a knife at his neck at the lake. And I don't know how he kept so calm at the time, but he stopped me. And I just remember that night specifically because it meant that, one, I was found, and two, that maybe I wasn't as bad. But, of course, the police took me in to the station, and they asked me to say what was going on. I don't know if the school rang and the police searched for me. That's what would normally happen, so I assume that's what was going on here. But it was so damaging that I just didn't know what to do. And I couldn't tell them that I was beaten at home. I couldn't tell them that I was in fights at school. I just couldn't say anything. All I could do was cry. And the officer was so, like, kind to me. And that was the first time that I ever really felt like that someone actually that I mattered, you know. And I very much became very distant from everything after that. And I remember after that, at the time, we were just heading into our last year of primary school, and we had to figure out what secondary schools we were going to. And in that year, at the start, I had a teacher who I will always remember. I'm not going to say his name for privacy stuff or anything, but he was the first one that really took me under his wing. He realized that my reading and writing skills were not in line with everything else of my abilities, and he put me through a dyslexia test. And it turns out, yeah, I was pretty heavily dyslexic. And I went through all of school not knowing. And from there on out, he taught me everything. From the ground up, he built up my reading, built up my writing, and he gave me, like, strategies to make meaning of how I would write. And what would happen is I would verbalize what I was saying, and I would talk about it that way. And at first, he would write it down for me, and he would show me what it looked like. And then afterwards, I would try to imitate it. Because at the time, letters meant nothing to me. I just didn't understand what they meant. But eventually, after a few months, working almost every lunchtime to try and get me somewhere, we found a breakthrough. And I found myself starting to be able to read. I found myself starting to be able to write. And I went from, like, bottom set group on ability in my year group to top set. And I became, like, all round incredibly academically gifted. And of course, because of all the behavior and because of all of the issues that I was going through at the time, grammar school was not in the question. A lot of the time, you know, everybody had doubted me, and everyone had kind of said he'll never make it out of grammar school. So initially, I wasn't put up. But that teacher changed so much, because after a few months, when the tests were due to be taken place, the head teacher eventually relented. My teacher back then refused to not let me take the test. You know, he wanted me to do it. And so the grammar school gave me, or sent a letter home to my parents saying that I was invited to take the test, which is how it generally works. So I took it. So test day comes along, and I was kind of scared initially, because of course I was going up against people that were somewhat privileged, which was not the case with me. You know, I'm not privileged in any way. I don't come from a wealthy background. I don't come from a various aspects of life like that. You know, I'm from a low-income family that has, like, no budget whatsoever. You know, there's no way that I should be academically gifted like that. But I went through to the school where they were holding the tests, and one of the invigilators at the time had clearly been told who I was and what I looked like and everything, and they took me aside. And when they took me aside, they told me that they'd given me a room to myself so that I can do the tests by myself and everything like that. And I had more time to do the exams than other people had. And at the time, I didn't know why. They never really told me why. But I found out afterwards it was because of my dyslexia diagnosis. So they gave me more time. But I sat down, breezed through the maths test, no problem whatsoever. The maths test was easy for me. But the English test was where I was worried that I was going to fall apart. Because, of course, I'd only just gotten passable at English. Even though I got to the point where I was at the top set, my reading was really not as strong as I would have liked. But I remember going through the test, and I was really stressing. I was going through a lot of meltdowns, and I could not really control my mental at all at that point. So when I was having a major anxiety issue, or when my attachment was starting to flare up, or my real problems started to come forward, it was noticeable that there was a significant performance drop. So we finished all the tests. There was 4 or 5 different tests we had to do in that day. And like they did to all of the kids, they said thanks for doing the test and everything like that. And everyone else went out before me. They obviously didn't want me to deal with all the social pressure and everything like that, because at this point, my attachment issues were known. And even though I felt alone, it didn't feel like I was pressured. And we go through the rest of the school year, and my behavior really showed a lot of deterioration. My mental health was getting worse and worse. Fights were getting more and more common at home. And yeah. Especially after the first suicide attempt, when the police brought me back home. My parents definitely grew a lot more aggressive. I think, honestly, they both were super toxic to each other, but neither one of them could afford to get out of it for obvious reasons. My father had very little qualifications, my mother hadn't worked for 15 years, who'd employ her, right? So a lot of that was rubbed off on myself and my sister. And my sister dealt with a lot of stuff that I didn't. And I can't really sort of share that for legal reasons, because that did go to court. So I can't really talk about that. But let's just say it was extremely bad. So August of that year comes round, and the letters came out for the test results for the grammar school and whatever. And the letter comes through the door, and immediately I just remember the words of my mum's head. You fucking failed, didn't you? You fucking mongol. And a lot of words that I can't use, because YouTube will just take this video down. Yeah. It wasn't good. And the damage had been done. But she opened up the letter, almost expecting it to say that I'd failed. And she was in this angry state. And when she opened it up and she read it, her face kind of changed. And it suddenly became a face of just I don't know what happened. Or this is a mistake, what's going on here? And without saying anything to me, she just thrust the letter at me and made me read it, which I was expecting it to be bad news, because it looked like it would potentially be bad news. But when I read the letter, it said, "Dear Mark, we're writing to inform you that you passed the the test for Paul Grammar School, and that you'll be attending from the start of September. And I don't necessarily remember like how I felt at the time, but I remember this like feeling of achievement and feeling that I'd done something that proved people wrong. And I think I remember like screaming so loud that one of our neighbors who lived next to us came over and asked if I was okay. And like it felt like that was the first time that I ever won against my parents. And it felt good. It felt like I finally had something. Because for so long, I'd convinced myself that I was just a nobody. And that I was just nothing more than a violent asshole. But that wasn't the case. So, we go to grammar school. And oh boy. So, I never really saw much of my grandparents throughout the early years of my primary school. We would go over them every now and then. And that was actually how my Pokemon journey started. My grandfather took me into a different room. And bought me back this Game Boy Color at the time. And it was like a Japanese console. Well, I think it was a Japanese console. No, it was Pokemon Green was in Japanese, but it was a Game Boy itself. And I don't remember what his words with me back then as a 4-year-old were. I don't remember what he said. But it was something like, keep it quiet. You know, don't tell anyone about this. So I didn't. I don't know if my parents ever knew about my Pokemon stuff. But like sometimes I would sneak out the house at like really silly hours. Just to try and go around. Or just go and play Pokemon in peace and quiet. And I would still play it. And I still play it to this day. So it's kind of strange how that all happened for a while. But I remember my first year at grammar school. We're about 2 months in. And while I was still struggling, I was getting in fights and all sorts and stuff like that. I had a very understanding head teacher who clearly knew everything that they'd been told. And a lot of the time, we were just getting into squabbles over needless things. You know, like who was better at this or who was good at that. Because the thing is, I was in a group of people that were as academically gifted as I was. And that felt weird to me. Because all of these people were not like me at all. Like, none of them had bags around their eyes because they weren't sleeping. None of them had, like, a lot of the issues that I had. But 2 months in, I got summoned to the headmaster's office. And, of course, my first thought is, oh crap, what have I done now? Have I blown it? And all of this. But it wasn't the case. And I got the news from the head teacher that my grandfather was in hospital. And they didn't know what was wrong with him, but he was going to be in hospital for a long time. And that broke me. Because even though my grandfather must have known what I was going through, even though I barely saw my grandfather that much, or as much as I would have wanted, because he and my nan treated me differently. It was like a safe space where my parents would never dare, like, do what they did at home. It felt like someone that was close to me was, well, in my head at the time, I thought he was dying. And that sent me into meltdown after meltdown after meltdown. And it would just get to the point where I would start, like, because I would constantly say that my grandfather's dying, that I would start harming myself. And it got to the point where I was punching walls. You know, I was, like, just hitting everything that I could get in my way. I was picking things up and throwing things, and yeah, it got bad. And at times, it would be banging my head against the wall, quite literally. And it would almost just be like knocking myself out to try and almost be at the hospital with him, which was stupid. But it was just who I was. Like, mentally, I just could not handle what was going on. I was under so much fire and so much stress under anything that even so much as anyone had called me a name that I didn't like, they would just send me into a meltdown. And people would talk, well, not necessarily talk about a lot of that, but it would be the talk of everyone else. And, like, that's all people would talk about, is, like, how I was like, hurting myself, how I was, like, just, like, a horrible person or whatever. And yeah, it hurt. And I went through all of my first year through grammar school just not at all knowing what I was going on, like what I was doing or anything like that. And it was at the start of my second year when my grandfather finally got discharged from hospital after 11 months. Or was it longer? No, I think it was 11 months. And that was a relief to me. And I remember going over to my grandparents a lot, like, as he came out and stuff like that. I don't remember necessarily too much of what happened then. But second year of school comes up, and issues at home started to translate to issues with neighbors. And there ended up being like a mass bust up between my parents and the neighbors' parents, and even some of the kids sometimes, including myself. And it got to the point where the police were called, and a lot of us were taken in, including myself. And it made the newspaper that there was this huge brawl and everything like that. And of course, names were being spread and like thoughts were being told. And that case ended up going to court. I was not at that case, I was at school. But my parents were. And from what I heard, I don't know the whole story of it. I only know the newspaper article that was made. That we were being evicted. So the court had judged that my parents were at fault. And that the council were evicting us. Which meant that we were homeless. And we had to find a place to live with me, my older sister, and two known troubled parents. And of course, with it making the newspaper, it very quickly spread to school. And because of that, all the kids found out, assumingly parents had told them, or whatever. And yeah, I noticed that a lot of people were, like, ridiculing me. Like, bullying me to the point where they're like, ah, you're homeless, you have nothing, and all this. And back then, even like a petition had come in from parents to the school to have me thrown out because I was a child of violent parents. And that was awkward. But with all of the meltdowns and with all the stress and everything that was going on and the damage that was being done, not only to myself but to people around me, I ended up having to see like a child therapist. And at that point, the therapist was there, but I could never talk about like what I was going on and everything like that, and the therapist could never get through to me at the time. But I was referred to a GP, and the GP had prescribed me like these antidepressants. And it very quickly came about that I was not able to like take these medications because they would make me sick. And of course, because I was sick, I would be missing school, and then of course I'd be at the whole household that was breaking me apart, that I didn't know this at the time. And things got worse and worse. It took a good amount of time. We were in temporary accommodation for a good couple of years before we ended up getting an actual place. And after that, yeah, my sister had run away from home. The abuse that my sister had got had caused her to go, which meant that I was on my own. And it meant it was 2 adults versus 1 kid. And of course, because my sister was the main target of all of the issues that were going on, the issue then fell onto me. And that was when a lot of things got worse. I ended up being on stronger medication because my meltdowns were getting so bad and the anxiety was flaring so badly that it was deemed that the medication I was on wasn't strong enough. And I started being on like 3 or 4 different medications every mealtime, which was dangerous for a child. And I don't know if that was the right thing, but my body had started developing antibodies to all of these medications. But we keep going through school, and at 15 years old was the second time I tried to end my life. And at this point, I had ended up developing like a major eating problem. I was constantly eating all the time. I never ate a lot at home during my earlier years, but it got to the point where I would start like cleaning cupboards out of food just daily, because every time I was stressed, all I could do was eat. And at that point, I was eating and I was eating and I was eating and I was eating to the point where I was eating like 6 family-sized meals a day. And this had been going on for a while. And at that point, I realized that if I just kept eating more and more and more, that I would eventually just die. Because, you know, I would not be able to support my organs or whatever. And that was all I wanted. I just couldn't handle everything because no matter where I was at, no matter what I did, I was never stable. And I would eat and I would eat and I would eat to the point where I could hardly walk. I could hardly move. I was getting injured all the time. And I ended up being very morbidly obese. And I was ashamed. I was ashamed of who I was. You know, I was this kid from a family of hell that, you know, had an eating problem. I went through therapist after therapist, like all kinds of courses of like CBT and various other things. And while they had an effect for a while, I was still dealing with everything at home. And I look back at that attempt when I literally would eat myself to be as sick as physically possible to try to end my existence. And I look back at that and I just think, how did that happen? How did I get to that point? Like, what could have possibly led to that when the truth is I'm not a horrible person? And even though I would get angry, I would get upset, and I would hurt people, I only really wanted to hurt myself. And it had gotten to the point where all I wanted to do was just leave where I was at. And I would try to go to a point because it was only at that point, really, that even the head teacher had said, what if we just gave you a place to go where you can just vent everything away? You know, you don't have to eat yourself. You don't have to eat yourself in the way you're doing. You don't have to do all of this. What if there was a way that we could release all of that stress on you in a much more controlled manner? And it had gotten to the point where the school had given me this room with a punching bag hung up in it. And they would say to me, there's always going to be a teacher in the gym anyway, because it was next to the PE, like, gymnasium. So, like, you know, there was always going to be a teacher or someone who could keep an eye on you and see how things were or whatever. So I started going to that room a lot. And for a while it was like once a day, but it very quickly became twice a day, 3 times a day, because everything was getting worse. And at the point where I turned 16, this was the point where I should be doing my GCSEs and be doing some very challenging exams and stuff like that, but I was a mess. I was still very heavily overweight. I was probably the heaviest I was ever been at that point. And I would just literally punch this punching bag as hard as I physically could. Sometimes I'd hit it so hard it would hit me in the face and knock me backwards. But I'd still get back up and keep hitting it, just to try and throw things away. And I think that was when a lot of people realized that I was hurting, but I was trying not to hurt other people. So the more I went to that room, the more angry I got sometimes, but it was a way that I could release it without, like, hurting anyone. No, unless, of course, it was myself. But it stopped me self-harming, for the most part. Like, I wasn't, like, trying to go anywhere. Like, people were scared of me doing cookery for GCSE because of the sharp knives and stuff like that, but that was something I enjoyed, so I never did it. And at that point, therapy still was not working as well as it would like, and the medications I was on were not working either. My body had developed all the antibodies and resistances to it, and continues to do so to this day. I cannot take medication whatsoever. But as far as my GCSEs go, I really struggled with confidence, because I was still feeling like I was a failure. And I went into those exams thinking that I was going to blow it. Because at that point, I was still not dealing with things properly. I was still constantly suffering these migraines. I was still, like, constantly struggling to have a good day. And we get through to just before the start of the exams when we were told to, like, fill out what we wanted to do for A-level. And I had no idea. I had absolutely no idea. The school had told me I had to do maths because that was my best subject by a mile, so they made me do that. And I'm kind of glad they did, because that was my subject all the time. I would nail maths every single time. And at that point, I got summoned to the headmaster's office. And actually, I think that was the first time that I ever got summoned, really, for the best reasons. Because I spent a lot of time in the headmaster's office when I was in a bad spot. I would go and vent, and then he would basically say, if you need to, come and sit in my office, and then you can just get on with your work. And that would happen quite often. Which was nice in a way, because it took away the pressures of everything else. But it also kind of sucked, because it meant that, you know, if I had to leave the classroom for whatever reason, it meant that someone had triggered me. But it never happened. So I go to the headmaster's office, and in there I met a teacher that I hadn't seen before, which confused me at the time because I didn't really know what to make of it. Of course, when it came to meeting new people, I really struggled. I couldn't handle it at all. It meant that my attachment disorder just didn't know what to do, didn't know how to do things, didn't know who to be or whatever. But it felt weird. But at the time, this teacher had introduced themselves as a psychology teacher. Now, I had no idea what psychology meant. I saw it in the subject list, but I had no clue what it was. And I remember the headmaster's words to me at the time was saying, I think you need to do this because I think you might know something about yourself if you do. And I was perplexed. I didn't know what it meant, or anything like that. But in the end, I put it down as what I wanted to do. So I did maths, psychology, business studies, economics, because they were the maths-based subjects and they were kind of fun for me. So that's what I ended up doing. And boy, were they right. That it was the right thing for me to do, because the first module we did was about like cognitive development and like early years, and that was when I truly understood everything, because at that point it had been revealed to me everything that was wrong. You know, it talked about role modeling and how you're conditioned by your primary caregivers, and the more I learned, the more I almost wished I didn't. But as much as it overwhelmed me, and as much as it was brutal for me to go through, the teacher made sure that I was okay throughout the whole thing. He had done everything possible to make sure that I could handle everything and stuff like that. And also at the same time, I was introduced to a child psychologist. And I've been through therapists and stuff like that before, and I was kind of concerned because it hadn't worked. I couldn't open up to anybody. I couldn't tell anyone anything, and I was just not, like, cooperating, I guess is the fairest way to put it. But she was different, because even though I was having these meltdowns, and even though there were still times when I was, like, hitting the wall, or still, like, going to the punching thing or whatever, unlike a lot of the therapists or the people that had worked with me in school before, she never shouted at me. And that was one of the biggest problems I had at home, was that I was used to people shouting at me. And of course, when people are shouting at you, you kind of become desensitized to it when that's the norm. So she realized that, but she never shouted at me once. But after I learned about the whole home stuff from my psychology degree, I couldn't handle it. And I went into quite a serious low point. Because it opened my eyes. And it opened my eyes to everything that the previous 17 years had done. And I didn't know what to do. So back then, I ran away from home. And I went missing for about 3 days. I was just gone. I would run as fast as my overweight body could carry me, which wasn't very fast at the time. But I would go as far away as I could, and I would just keep walking. eventually I found myself in, I think it was like, it wasn't like a park or anything, but it was like a garden area that had a bench on it, and I basically just put myself on that bench, and I stayed there until I was found. And because I was like really tall and like really bulky, and at the time, I feel like a lot of people just assumed I was a homeless person, because I looked older than I was. Obviously, I was still a kid, right? But I was eventually found, by my nan, of all people. It turned out my nan had walked through that area all the time, and I didn't know. She found me and went absolutely mad. And I just remember, like, no, I may be misremembering that. But I definitely remember my nan being mad at me. And I remember my nan not knowing what was going on. And I end up at my grandparents' house with my nan and my grandfather, and I'm sat there on this chair. And I remember that day so vividly because that was the first time when I had said to them that I was being hit every day. And I never told them about the suicidal thoughts. I never told them about the times I tried to commit suicide or anything like that. I couldn't tell them that. But I showed them, like, some of the handprints I had on my back from the few days before that was still, like, faint, but they were still there. And, like, some of the scars I had on my shoulder. And I just remember my nan bursting into tears. She had, I don't know how much she really knew about what was going on, but she was so, like, upset. And I remember my grandfather getting rattled. You know, my grandfather was military, so, like, anything like that really unsettled him. And they basically said to me at the time, "You're staying here until it's safe for you to go home." And at that point, my grandparents had contacted the school to say that they'd found me, that I'm at their place, I'm safe, and all of that. And then I'd be going back to school, ASAP, basically, when I was feeling well, because at the time I was really cold. I was really hungry because I had barely eaten. And at that point, I could not I understood what was happening to me, but my whole world changed. Because after, like, talking to the school and everything like that, it was decided that I stayed at my grandparents for the rest of my schooling. But I went from a world where I had to ask to do anything. When it comes to my parents, I had to ask to eat food, I had to ask to do my own homework, I even had to ask to go to the toilet or anything like that back then, otherwise I was just locked in my room. To a world where I had my grandfather saying to me, "Mark, so long as you can prepare to take the consequences of whatever you choose to do, you do whatever you want." And my mind was blown. I had no idea what that meant. And even though I was still going through my first year of A-levels, I was still doing a lot of the things that I was still doing at home. Like, I was shutting myself away because all I ever knew was, this is my room, this is my space. And I was very introverted. Like, I didn't want my grandparents to kind of see what I was going through. And I feel bad about that even to this day, because I wish I could tell them everything. But I couldn't. And going through My eating was a lot better. My sleeping slowly started to improve. My insomnia was still bad. I would be getting an hour, 2 hours maybe, and then falling out or waking up again, finding myself pacing my room constantly, which is what I used to do a lot, even back at home. And I would sit there and I would try and find my way back, and sometimes I just wouldn't be able to go back to sleep. But there were times when I was able to at least get something, and it was worlds different. I had a settled routine. I would wake up, I would eat my breakfast, which was something that never really happened at home. I never had breakfast at all. And I would have stuff to take to school. You know, it would be like snack period, maybe some food for lunch or whatever. And a water bottle that I had throughout the whole day. Which I would just go and fill up, and I'd have it next to me all the time. We weren't technically supposed to, but the school let me do it for obvious reasons. I was going through stuff. So they let me do it because it was a calming strategy for me. It was drinking water. Which is as weird as it sounds, but it's actually surprising how effective it is when that kind of becomes your condition. And I remember going back to school for the first day. And it was hard because obviously people had known that I'd gone missing and stuff like that. So people were still wary of me, as they always were. I knew that. But I saw a lot more of a psychologist and everything like that, and she would just talk to me. Like, she would talk to me like a normal human being. And she was very maternal in so many ways. She almost treated me like the mom I never had, in a way. But that was when I started to show signs of life. I started to show signs of being able to get through a day like without having meltdowns. And it would be one day, maybe 2 days I'd have a meltdown. Sometimes I could go a week, but I'd still have them. And I would still struggle, and they would still get really, really bad to the point where I might hit a wall once in a while or anything. But there was some semblance of control, which was something I never had before. So, with more and more work from the psychologist to bring me everything that I had, and alongside working with my grandparents, who were very active in like helping me get through school and everything like that, a lot changed. And I found myself going into my second year of A-levels almost a completely different person. And over that summer, my grandparents had spoken to our neighbors. My grandparents lived in like a very, very quiet like cul-de-sac. There was 5 bungalows, all people that retired and stuff like that. But our neighbor was like a handyman. He did like all things like woodwork. He did things like that, electronics. He did like a lot of like fixing things and restoring things, like stuff like that. And he had come over on one day over the summer, and he said, "Hey, Mark," you know, which was like, "Whoops, what's going on here? I ain't talking to me." I was still struggling to deal with like the social interactions at times. But he said, "Hey, Mark, I fix a lot of furniture and stuff like that. Would you like to help me out?" And at first I was kind of wary, because I didn't quite know like how that was gonna go. But I loved it. And it was just one of the most fun things that I did, and we would do it for a few hours, you know, in the afternoons or whatever. And then in the evenings, another neighbor was part of like a cycling club. Now at the time I was still pretty heavily overweight. I was not necessarily good, but my grandparents had bought me a bike, and that was like the first bike I ever had, so I never really knew how to ride a bike until like I was 17, which is kind of embarrassing when you think about it, but some people just never learned, and I was one of those people. But eventually I joined these clubs. Well, not really a club in case of fixing furniture, but I joined a cycling club. He taught me everything, and stuff like that, and I felt so much better in myself. I felt like I wasn't horrible, or I wasn't a monster, and that I could do things now which I couldn't do before. You know, and I found myself learning and doing more and constantly getting better. I even started to learn to drive. I never took my test, but I'd started to have driving lessons. I actually got very good at it for quite a while. Really enjoyed it. The only reason I never did the test is because, well, a little bit later. But throughout that whole summer, I really started to grow in confidence. I started to talk more. I could never still talk about what happened at home, like, not to the full extent. But it was finally known that I was in a stable place for the first time ever. You know, and it showed. I remember going back into my final year of secondary school, and the psychologist had phoned my grandparents after the first week back, and I remember her words. She said, "This was the mark that was there all along." And I cried. Because I didn't know, like, how to feel when I found out that that's what someone had thought of me. But it showed, because the other kids had become less wary of me. They were starting to talk to me. They felt like they could approach me, and they weren't scared of me anymore. And I don't know. Maybe they knew the whole time. Maybe they knew that I was dealing with stuff. I don't know. There were times when I wasn't in the classroom. Same with the other thing. They may have been told. But I started opening up a lot, especially to the psychologist, who changed everything for me. She was there. She oversaw so much more. And while I still had my rough days, and while I still had everything that was going on, I was making progress. I was becoming independent. I'd learned how to cook way better than I could during my GCSE years. My grandparents had taught me so much, and I owe my grandparents my life, because hell, I would have taken it a long time ago. And even after that, we had a lot of joint lessons. I went to an all-boys grammar school, but occasionally we had joint lessons with the girls' school down the road. And that was when I met my now ex-girlfriend. Sounds very weird, given everything that was going on, but we'd clicked. She was a relatively new person towards the school. She transferred over from another town or whatever, and yeah, she sat next to me like the first day she was in. I used to generally prefer to sit on my own. I'd like to be like at the front of the classroom, or like I was near a door in case I needed to step out for a minute, which happened a lot less in my last year than it did before. In fact, it got to the point where a couple of months in, I wasn't leaving the classroom at all. Like, at least not for a little while. I did end up, like, later in the year, like, having a couple of moments, but they were far less severe. Well, except one, which we'll get to. And she and I talked a lot. We spent a lot of time. We found out that we were both Pokemon fans, which was interesting, so we would just talk about Pokemon every now and then. And occasionally, because of the way lessons worked out, sometimes we had like lunchtime at the girls' school, because we had like a lesson straight after, so we would go to the girls' school at lunchtime, have our lunch down there, and then we'd have our class afterwards. And that was when we started getting a bit more. Now, I didn't know what relationships were or anything like that. Everyone else was talking about having girlfriends or whatever. I didn't know what it was. I had no idea until she kissed me the first time round. And for a while, it was like a blessing, because it meant that I had someone that was like my age, because the problem I had, as much as I loved my neighbors back at my grandparents, and I still do, they're amazing people. Like, I was finding myself in social groups with people way older than me, way more mature than me, but it gave me the grounding that I needed. So my ex and I would spend a lot of time together, for quite a while, and it got to the topic of university, because it was very clear we were both going. And I didn't know what I was going to do at university at the time. No one had really told me. So I ended up making a decision very late. But something that came up at the school that the psychologist asked me to do at the time was the school had paired up with like a local infant school. And basically it was we would go down to the infant school and we would read with kids for a bit. And at the time I was scared, because I thought to myself, what if I have a meltdown there? Like, what if something goes wrong there, and that I would do something really horrible? Well, that never happened. So we got lucky in that regard, and I'm grateful for that. But I found myself just loving it. And I remember my psychologist joking with me at the time, saying, you should probably be a teacher, you know. And at the time, I just looked at her. I was just like, are you serious? Have you seen me? What I used to be like? Have you seen who I am? Who's going to want me teaching them? So I took it home to my grandparents, that thought, and this was kind of the first time that I heard the phrase, why not? And it was my grandfather. And my grandfather had said to me, well, why can't you do it? Why can't you be a teacher? And at the time I spoke to my partner, and I said, what are you going to do? And she said the same thing. But she was going to go into teaching as well. And I was just like, cool, great. So we started talking about universities. We traveled together a lot to these different universities. And we settled on Plymouth, which is where we ended up going. And at first it was kind of a little awkward. We wanted to get a place together. For obvious reasons. We wanted to stay together a lot. That never ended up happening, because when we got accepted and when we were looking for accommodation, we couldn't find like a block that wanted 2 people. We could only find like individuals. So we ended up not living together at the time. And while it was a little sad, it was perfectly okay. We saw a lot of each other. We always like stayed around each other's places and stuff like that. And it was great. My first year at university was a big change, because of course I was away from my grandparents for 9 months of the year. And I was like 3 hours away from where I'm from now, over in Bournemouth. So it was a long way. And I found it hard to deal with at first, because I was away from the support that I'd known in the last couple of years. But the psychologist had kept in touch. After the year, we kind of messed up a little bit of our A-levels, but we got into university on an unconditional offer, so that was awesome. And we went through, and that's when things between me and my partner started to fall sour, because we had gone through our first year. We both passed flying colors first year, no problems whatsoever, no failed assignments or whatever. But that was when my partner decided to drop a bombshell on me. So my partner, well now my ex-partner, as it became, had decided that she wanted a child. And I've never told anyone about this, so this is going to be a hard one for me. But, she wanted a child, which we weren't ready for. We were still at university. We were 19 years old, you know, or she was 19, I was still 18, because my birthday was a little later. And yeah, that was when I realized that something was wrong. Because throughout the whole time, what she was doing was basically going through my social media and like blocking away my friends that were like somewhat okay looking or whatever in her eyes. She was basically deciding who I was and wasn't friends with. And when I told her that I didn't want a child because there was no way we could do it, we started seeing less of each other. And by less of each other, it meant that we stopped seeing each other for a long period of time. And in the end, in my second year, I stayed in a flat by myself completely. Not even with housemates, just a simple, like, apartment room myself. And I enjoyed that. And at the time, just before the end of first year, I guess, so we'll backtrack a little bit. I started joining a lot of societies, a lot of clubs. I played like a lot of badminton. That was one of my favorite things, and that was when I met someone who became very close to me. She was a psychology student, Rosie, and she happened to be from Bournemouth. I'd never met her before. She didn't go to the girls' grammar school, so I never knew who she was. But we bonded over the fact that we were from Bournemouth. We played badminton, and we both loved Pokemon. I found another close Pokemon fan. So, my ex didn't like that. My ex didn't like that Rosie was close to me. And I think she was trying to, like, rid her out. But eventually, going into the start of my second year of university, a lot of things went down. And it turned out that my now ex was actually cheating. She had gone around this person's house. I had no idea how they met or anything. I don't know the story. And they'd slept together, and she'd got pregnant. Which, of course, is what she wanted the whole time. But the guy that she got pregnant with ended up finding out about me through her Facebook page. Because of the relationship status thing. Because it had that I was in a relationship with her. Which, of course, initially he got really mad and was like, what the hell's going on? But eventually he reached out to me. Surprisingly amicably. I don't know why it was amicable or whatever. But he asked to speak to me. And that was when he told me. So I didn't know who this guy was or anything. But when he told me that my partner was cheating on me, I lost, like, everything. My whole motivation, my whole morale, like, the person I actually was comfortable with more than anyone, you know, even Rosie at the time, had betrayed me. And at that point, just as I was finally starting to feel like I could control my attachment disorder and just finally started to be comfortable around people, it was gone. And I just remember so much of the aftermath of that, because all hell went loose. Both me and this other guy had completely distanced ourselves from my ex. Completely distanced herself. We blocked her on all social media and stuff like that. And of course, she dropped out of university. So, obviously, because I was living on my own at the time, I became very despondent. I started doubting myself again for the first time in a long time. I was still always, like, not sure, I guess was the way to put it. Maybe that's the wrong expression. I'm not sure. But, like, I was at my worst when it came to my attachment disorder. I had shut up shop to everybody. People in class, I wouldn't talk. I wouldn't even talk to my lecturers all that much. I used to be very vocal during my lectures. I used to like like asking questions, trying to learn as much as possible. And it was a very noticeable drop. I stopped going to societies, and I just remember Rosie getting so worried about me. She would message me sometimes, and I wouldn't answer. She would even turn up at my door to my apartment sometimes, just to make sure I was okay, and sometimes I just couldn't bring myself to answer. And I always remember seeing her so upset, because she and I confided in each other quite a bit. We used to talk a lot. We ended up talking a hell of a lot more after that. Because of course she did a psychology degree, right? So she kind of understood. And eventually I found it in myself to open up to her. And that was when I told her about everything. More or less. You know, what happened with the relationship and everything like that. And I was scared when I told her that she was gonna think less of me. That she was gonna hate me. And that's what I felt like everybody did. Like, people turned away from me not because they hated me, but because they thought I hated them. But it wasn't that. I was just so closed up because my whole world had gone that I'd convinced myself back then that everyone just wanted to use me. And maybe they were right. But it's not the case. And even though back then I couldn't think about that, all I could think about was how I was stupid. And how that I was a failure of a person, you know. I didn't give my partner what she wanted, and, you know, I blame myself for everything that went wrong in that relationship, even though maybe it wasn't my fault. I don't know. But I very clearly made the decision in myself at that point that I was never gonna enter a relationship again. I didn't want another relationship after that. And yeah, I found it hard to talk to people. Even the psychologist who kept in touch with me on more of like a social contact, I struggled to even tell her. And she was the person I trusted the most at the time. And then, of course, there was Rosie. So, and I just remember seeing the tears streaming down Rosie's face when I told her, like, what had happened. But instead of, like, loathing me, or instead of, like, turning away from me like other people did, she hugged me and wouldn't let go until I stopped being so down on myself. Because I was beating myself up over something that maybe I did wrong, maybe I didn't. But I always remember her words to me, because she would say to me, "It's not your fault when someone hurts you. It's not your fault that you weren't ready. What will be your fault is if you gave up for it." You know? But she would always remind me of how, like, I was a talented teacher and everything. She would always, like, take away a lot of the negative thoughts in my head and would replace them with positive. And at that point, my insomnia had gotten really bad. I was not sleeping well at all. I was starting to be a lot worse for wear. I was, like, really, like, struggling. I had times when my personal hygiene wasn't great. Because obviously I was struggling to deal with everything again. But Rosie got me through it. She would message me all the time, and I remember when she first started, like, she would send me, like, a selfie of her with, like, a wide smile on her face. And one of the favorite things she used to say to me, just like as a little caption, was, "If I can smile today, so can you." And those words were very powerful to me, because at the time I wasn't smiling a lot. I was very inside myself, but she would bring me out. Right? She would push me to kind of take away that strain, but every morning she would do it. All the time. She would send me these captions and she would send me these pictures. And I'd respond back just to let her know that I was okay. And if I didn't respond back, she would call me later, or like she would see me during university and wonder what happened or whatever. But she looked out for me. And obviously, very quickly, she became my best friend by a mile. And I don't know what I would have done without her, because she brought me through some of the hardest times I went through in that period. She started staying over a lot more. She would just talk to me. And sometimes we would play badminton together and go back to hers and just play Pokemon or play Scrabble or something. And we would just talk. And sometimes she would talk about something that she was dealing with, and sometimes I'd talk about what I was dealing with. And she just made the day feel so much easier. And in a day where I wasn't myself, she would always find a way to bring me back. And I don't know how she would do it, but she always did. And it became a lot for me. I put a lot of pressure on her. Because I would constantly just like need that person to talk to. But she never said no. She always was there. And I finally felt like I had like a perfect friendship, I guess. I think was the nicest way to put it. Because I had friends. Like, I met friends at uni that I would play poker with, or, you know, I'd play badminton with, or Pokemon with, and occasionally we would play a stupid Facebook Scrabble or whatever. But, like, I didn't feel like I had anyone that I could really open up to, except for Rosie. And that definitely weighed on me a lot, that I struggled in myself to open up to other people. But I just felt like I couldn't build that trust with anyone because, of course, I had my trust broken by someone very close to me. So, we go into my third year of university. I had the summer at my grandparents', spent a fair bit of time with Rosie as well. We hung out every now and then. We'd talk to each other. You know, it was Skype most of the time back then, but we would talk to each other a lot. We would call each other, see how people were doing, see how things were going. And at that point, I started to play a lot of like online games. You know, I started to play games like League of Legends. I started to play Pokemon online games. I started to play like Civ 5 was a thing that I played a fair bit back then. And I would find myself gaming with people and not struggle. I'd be pretty happy just sitting there playing games or whatever. I'd still get my classwork done and everything, but I would quite happily play games as long as I could. Because gaming was my escape, right? You know, the Pokemon started to become a lot more of a thing. Like, I played competitive for a long time. I would sneak out of my, the prison that was my parents' house, to go to a lot of, like, Pokemon events, even as a 10-year-old when I was struggling, with serious health issues. I would still go to, like, a local shop and play or whatever. And it was great. I loved it. Even though I was playing against people who were older than me and would beat me fairly often, I found myself just loving Pokemon and just loving playing. And that was kind of the way that things went. In my third year of university, I struggled a little, because I think that was the year that my grandfather had relapsed again with a lot of his major issues. And that hit me pretty hard because I thought we had gotten over the worst of it back when I was still 11 years old. But here we are at 20 and it's back again. And I always remember my grandfather saying, don't worry about it, it will be fine, and everything like that. But it wasn't fine, because he was in hospital, basically, like, not paralyzed, but struggling for movement. In general. So, it became very, very challenging. So that knocked me for 6, and I remember Rosie even struggling to like deal with me at times, because I would vent out. And I didn't fail that year at all. I passed that year just the same as I'd done every other year, but I felt like I didn't deserve it. You know, I almost dropped out of university then because I just wanted to be back home. You know, I was 3 hours away from my family, and my family was in hospital, and I felt like I wasn't doing anything. But obviously that wasn't the case, and my nana told me to stay at university and not go home unless you physically could, like you had days off or whatever, which didn't really happen too much at university. We had like periods off, like we would have like an afternoon where we weren't in, or like a morning we weren't in, but like we very rarely had full days off. So that obviously never happened. But even in that year, like, honestly, Rosie did a lot because she would just let me talk. Like, there would be times when she would call me because she knew I was, like, not really feeling like showing my face, and she would just let me vent that way. But there were times when she would come over and just make sure I was eating, because one of the biggest problems I had when I was going through a lot of these struggles, especially with my anxiety, my social anxiety got really bad. I think I was formally diagnosed with my social anxiety that year. I was kind of loosely diagnosed with it before, but it was never really proven because of my attachment disorder. But I got assessed for my social anxiety disorder in that year because after like a lot of traumatic issues, they originally thought it was PTSD, which it may well be, but that was never confirmed. I did an assessment for PTSD and it came back negative. Although I still feel like I may have PTSD. But that was the year when I struggled to eat, but I lost a lot of weight. I'd finally started to be a little bit like I am now. I was a little bit heavier back then. I've actually lost more weight since, which I'll talk to you guys about at the end. But that year was hard. My grandfather was in hospital for most of it, but when he came out, it was such a huge relief because it meant that I didn't lose my grandfather. Because at the time, especially when I was younger, I was told that it might be terminal. So we'd been worried about it ever since, you know. It's like, my grandfather's a very proud man, so when he couldn't walk or he couldn't do anything, he would get upset. Because he was very much the get up and go type of guy, which, you know, now isn't the case anymore because he physically can't, but still. But we keep going for university, and we hit my final year, which is the hardest year I had to go through. And Rosie also had her final year, so we spent a lot of time like doing assignment work, but I think I overstressed myself a lot in that year, especially with everything that was going on. I would put myself in a really unhealthy spot, where I would just kind of doubt myself. I was in that kind of end of year or like end of course struggle where I think a lot of people go through this, where they're just like, oh my god, what if I fail this year, and what if I've blown everything, what if I've done everything that I shouldn't have done, or whatever. But it didn't happen. Rosie graduated pretty quickly. She had finished lodge, not early necessarily, but she finished before me. I still had my final placement to do. But we got there. And I remember going to the graduation ceremony with Rosie at the time. We traveled down together. And oh man, it was so great to feel like I achieved something by myself in a way. Obviously I had Rosie with me, but it was everything to me. Because that was the biggest turning point, I think, for me as a person. I'd graduated, I'd become a fully qualified teacher, and I got a job very quickly. I'd signed up to an agency originally, but I got my first job very fast. I think a lot of people had recognized that I was talented. I got away with a 2-1, which is like the second highest grade you could get. I didn't quite get a first, I was just off it, which is a little unfortunate. I would have loved to have got that first, but honestly, when it comes to education degrees, for those who are ever interested in teaching in the UK, I don't know why you would be at this time of the year, but like, your grade doesn't matter, so long as you pass. That's all you need. You just need the QTS, the Qualified Teacher Status. But I got it. And I was looking around for jobs. And I remember this one school that I ended up going to. I'm not going to name the school or whatever. But I remember a friend of mine who lived in the area, and he said to me, Mark, if you take that job, you're an idiot. You're going to throw away your career. Why would you do this to yourself? And me being me, and me kind of being the guy that likes to prove people wrong, I went and applied for the job, and I got it straight away. There was only like 3 other people that had applied for it, and I'd beat them out at the interview. So I did my NQT year, and this school was, let's say, somewhat challenging, is the nicest way to put it. There was a lot of, like, children in, like, low-income families, just like I was. And I remember one specific case of a particular child, and this was the making of my career in so many ways, but also semi the breaking of it too. I had taught this young lad, and he basically was being beaten at home by his parents. Well, by his dad specifically. And he'd come in to school in, like, absolute red mist. And he'd come in, he was so angry, he picked up a chair and threw it at me. And it hit me in the side of the head just here. And it reminded me of my past when I had those meltdowns, because that's what I used to do. And while it hit me and it hurt me, and I was upset, because obviously it did, I just remember this young lad being even more upset than I was. And it turned out that he had a handprint on his back, which is much like what happened to me. And I burst into tears completely. I had become overwhelmed emotionally. And I ended up effectively standing up in court, defending this kid because of what was going on and stuff like that. And that was definitely challenging. That was very emotionally straining on me, but we got the result we wanted. I can't talk any more about it than that for legal reasons. But that really changed my career to the point where I was so obsessed with getting the best result for every child, because if I could do it for one, I could do it for all of them, right? And that was the challenge. That was the challenge. And it became very obvious that as a result of that, I would devote everything I had to the classroom. Even the summer holidays. It would be the same thing. It would be, I would get through one group of kids, and I'd be really kind of sad that I would end up ending. Like, teachers have this thing where, like, you kind of become really attached to the class you're working with, because you're with them for 9 months, right? You're there the whole time. And you're like their primary, like, well, not primary, you're their secondary caregiver while you're there, so they mean a lot to you. But I would just obsess over the classroom, and it took me a long time to realize what was actually going on. Because after the year went over, at the end of the year, I got told by the head teacher that I wasn't being kept for the following year, which really hurt me, because I put everything I had into that class, But it was financial reasons for the school, was the reason they gave me. And so I had to look for another job. Luckily, the first time round, I found another job pretty fast. I'd got into a job pretty quickly, as was the same the previous year, so it wasn't too stressful. But I spent all of that summer, like, researching all of the kids that I was going to be teaching, and that's all I did, was I would obsess over what I was going next, to the point where Rosie was, like, I was less sociable. I was less sociable to even Rosie. I would not play with her as much. I would not talk to her as much. But during the actual term time, I'd shut myself up to everybody, including Rosie at times. And no matter what I did, it just felt like I was in the wrong place. And as the years go by, I'm still teaching, and I'm still, like, in my own eyes, I'm just working my way, you know, towards having a stable, like, career. But every single year from 2014 to 2017, I was not kept the following year. And that was when I realized just what was going on in the profession. Like, schools were having to let teachers go all the time, let TAs go, you know, even take less children in because they couldn't afford to keep them, because the education system in the UK, as is the case globally at the moment, is just broken. It's just a political pawn for certain people to get elected. So, when it comes to that, we go through a couple of years, and the third year, 2017, was the first year that I did not get a job by September. I had not got anywhere, and I remember that summer being particularly broken. I'd lost confidence in myself. I lost a lot of friends during the last few years at that point because I just wasn't talking to them. I just, like, fell out of the habit of talking to people. And it turns out it was just destroying me. Like, teaching, the classroom, everything that I'd loved, you know, and I was working all the time. I'd be in at 7 a.m, I'd leave, like, late into the evening. A lot of the time I used to annoy all the groundskeepers I used to work with because I was always in there so late, so they couldn't lock up on time. But I would keep doing it because I enjoyed doing it. But that summer was particularly hard. That was the last sort of summer where I was basically put back on medication again. I was put on a very short stint of a sleeping agent called citalopram. Citalopram basically works in, like, you take it, and after a couple of hours you start feeling drowsy, and then you kind of try and sleep. But even through then, there were times when I would feel drowsy, but I would never go to sleep. I would just be led in my bed, drowsy, suffering, in pain. And it terrified Rosie. It absolutely terrified Rosie. Because she'd known that I was obsessed with the classroom. She knew that not being there at the start of the year absolutely crushed me. But throughout the time, I was talking to myself and to Rosie at times about quitting the profession. Because I felt like I was abandoned. And while it wasn't necessarily the case, it was just the competitive nature of teaching and the jobs market. My area is not the most affluent, so there's not a lot of money in these areas. There's not a lot of funding and stuff like that. So the start of that year comes around in September, and I'm still looking for a job. And I applied to this school that was still looking for a teacher. And originally I felt like I flunked the interview. My observation that I had to do for that interview was not my best. It definitely wasn't a good lesson. It was very clear that I'd lost my confidence. But somehow I got the job, which was a pleasant surprise. Has to be said, it was a very, very pleasant surprise that I got the job. But I was very, very grateful that I got it. And this was like my one opportunity in my head to like save my career. But what ended up happening is throughout that whole year, loved the kids. By far and away my favorite class I ever taught. And I shouldn't have favorites, but I loved everything about that class. It was a class that was just perfect for me, right? You know, it had the perfect blend of amazing personalities that brought out the best of me. Because I loved being the guy that had a sharp sense of humor. I loved being the guy that was able to, like, have a bit of a joke with the kids and make them laugh and, like, take away, like, the stress of learning. Because, hell, a lot of us don't like learning, you know, especially as adults. But when it came down to it, I had gone back to the obsession that I had done the previous 3 years. I was just obsessed with the classroom. In fact, probably even more obsessed with this class than I ever was. You know, I'd be in so long. I would be barely getting any sleep at all. My insomnia just got so bad. There would be times when I'd almost go like a week, 2 weeks without sleeping at all, which was terrifying. And it was very obvious that I was struggling. So I reached out to the psychologist who still is in contact with me to this day. I'm actually still working with her now, and we'll get to that. And everything felt so much better after I spoke to her. But even she brought up the possibility of me quitting teaching altogether. Because she recognized it, and Rosie had recognized it, that I was basically working myself into the ground. I was basically slowly, for want of a better expression, killing myself. And that realization really hit me hard. In the holidays, like the staff term, or like half term-ish, sort of around Easter, most of it. I spent a lot of time genuinely considering quitting. And it was a hard decision to make, but eventually, obviously the assessments go around about keeping staff and everything like that. And I was expecting the worst. You know, even though I was performing well with that class, I was getting very good reviews on my Ofsted, I was getting small criticisms to work on, but I was working on those, and I was still in a good spot. The inevitable, we can't afford to keep you, came back. And that meant that I had 6 weeks of this class left. And I knew at that point I had to quit. So everything that I had studied for at university, everything that I trained for, and everything that I did, I had to give up. And there were days in the last few weeks, even with the kids, that was very hard for me to deal with. And one particular incident, and I've talked about this briefly on stream, is an incident I had. I was out playing football with the kids, out at a lunch break, which is something I always love to do. I always love to go out and play with the kids and kind of give them a social role model to work with, and also burn some steam, you know, get some exercise in, because why not, right? But one particular time, one of the young lads, he was very fearless. He was like a third of my size, but he would run at me every time I had the football. Like, he had no fear. But he was coming at me so fast that I had to take evasive action to avoid him. And in doing so, I lost my balance, and I fell over, and I crashed into a picket fence, and my glasses smashed and cut the top of my eye all the way down the side of my nose, and I just had blood gushing down me, or like just gushing out of me onto the floor. And I don't really remember what happened much after that. I remember I was losing a lot of blood. I found myself waking up in a hospital bed, so I must have lost so much blood that I fainted in the ambulance or something. I don't actually remember too much about it, but I remember waking up afterwards with like a face covering over my left eye and everything like that, while I was waiting to see a doctor. And I tried to get up, and of course it started bleeding again because it was opened up by accident. So the doctor came and fixed it and said, and told me what had happened. So obviously I'd remembered crashing into the picket fence. I remember like the whole thing happening, but I don't remember like what happened briefly after that. And the doctor told me that I was gonna have, I think it was 13 stitches in the end. It was only supposed to be less than that, but because of complications with where the cut was, it ended up being more and closer together, so it was open still. But this was when I realized way too much how much the kids meant to me, because I was told specifically by the doctor that I was not to go back to work until the stitches were out, which was going to be 2 weeks away. And I couldn't do it. I was sat at home, like, feeling absolutely miserable. I was here in the same place I am now. I've been here since 2015. And I just remember, like, Rosie used to bring me stuff from work. Well, not from work, but, like, on the way home from her work. She graduated as a psychologist. She actually worked as a child psychologist briefly, too. Which was cool. I never specifically worked with her as much. She did come to a lot of the schools I worked with. She did actually work on one of my kids once, but kind of loosely, I guess. More working with a group of kids. One of them just happened to be mine. So that was a nice experience to have, like, your close friend with you at all times. And all this time, like, I remember Rosie was still sending me these pictures. Like, those morning selfies got me through the day, because there were times when I was just so depressed and like feeling so useless because I was sat at home when I should be teaching these kids, and it got to the point where I even remember my neighbor at the time, like, he would always say to me, because I would still get up even when I had energy left in the tank, like a few days afterwards, because I had nothing for a while. I'd lost so much blood that it is, like, really debilitating. I would get up and I would put my work clothes on and I would go to work, and he would literally be outside my door and be like, "Don't you dare." Don't you even think about it. Because he knew as well that I was just so, even in conversations we would have, like, as he was my neighbor, he only lives like 15 feet behind me. He doesn't anymore, he's moved out and got a different neighbor now, but he knew all I would talk about was the kids. All I would talk about was like work. I wouldn't really talk about social stuff. I would still game, I would still play, but it was very rare, especially during term time. It was mostly in the summers or like holidays or weekends that I would play a lot more games. And a week into the 2 week, like, holiday, I guess you could say, I'd gone back to work. I physically could not stop myself any longer. And I was back in the classroom with stitches in my eyes, or like not in my eyes, but above my eyes and stuff. And I must have looked awful. I don't know how I must have looked back then. I don't like my picture taken or anything like that. I'm still struggling now to deal with, like, looking at myself, but it's something that I'm getting better at. And it meant that the kids were kind of a little worried, obviously. The kids were heartbroken when it happened, but the kids were even more worried when I came back. And I think, like, after my stitches was taken out, that was when I had fully confirmed with myself that I needed to get out of teaching. I realized way too late that I was, like, so all work, no play, that my whole social anxiety, my whole attachment disorder was peaking, like, really badly. And it was heartbreaking, because the last day of my whole teaching career, in, like, July of 2018, I don't think I ever cried so much. Even throughout all of the abuse that I had going forward, even throughout the whole like, career that I'd gone through, because you always go through that last day, like, sadness where you miss your kids already and stuff like that, but that one felt especially bad. But that summer also became the worst for me, because that summer was the last time that my depression had gotten so bad. So I used to get a lot of, like, night terrors and stuff when I did eventually fall asleep, and they would come back, and they would come back worse than ever. And my night terrors were that moment when I was 10 years old and at that lake, and it would always be that moment when I put that knife to my neck. And there were times when I would, like, wake up and would not feel it or whatever, but there were times when that knife went in. And I'm so ashamed of what happened, but at that point, at the back end of summer 2018, the nightmare became real. I had said to myself that I would do the one thing that I should never have done, which was go back to that lake. So I did the same thing I did as a 10-year-old. I went back to that lake, knife in my back, and I held it to my neck. And I don't know how to this day, and I'll never know, but Rosie knew. And Rosie was already there, or, like, Rosie had found me. And I felt so terrible, because the one person that didn't know about the suicide attempts, didn't know about the damage that was done, as much as I could have told her, of course, saw that, and it was so awful. And her face, like, burns inside my eyes now sometimes, when I just saw the tears flooding down her face. I literally had hurt my best friend. But after that, I'd gone back into therapy. I had admitted myself, basically, for therapy. I'd gone to my GP and I'd explained what had happened. And alongside that, Rosie had decided that we were gonna live together for a while. We were gonna basically fix me up. And her words at the time were, "I'm gonna lovingly kidnap you until you're better." And she did. In a way, she did. But at the time, we were still like, we were always close. Like, she never left my side, despite how many times I'd deteriorated, despite how many times I called myself a failure and everything like that. And I remember talking about like building computers and stuff, because that used to be what I did a while back. Was I would just fix computers for people, because I was pretty good with my own PC at the time, even though I was mostly gaming on a laptop, which is kind of funny, because the laptop was not built for gaming, but I was still able to play like League of Legends at 20 FPS, and I thought I was god tier. Oh dear. But we ended up getting on the topic of Twitch and streaming, because obviously one of the things that I have never been particularly keen on, or anything like that, was my own appearance. You know, even though I had lost weight and I had looked somewhat normalish, I guess you could say, I'm still technically, medically speaking, overweight, but not by a lot at the moment. And we were watching a stream together. I don't remember who we were watching. I think it was a Pokemon stream. It might have been A-Drive or someone like that. And Rosie had asked me, "Hey Mark, why don't you try that?" And at the time, I was just like, there's no way, right? Why would anybody want to watch me? Like, I'm just an ugly British guy that plays Pokemon, right? Who's gonna watch me, right? And she kept saying the same phrase that my grandfather used to say, which is, why not? And every single time I would say to her that I couldn't do something, that was what she would always say, why not? So, once, like, the end of 2018 came about, that was when I basically had joined the security profession. So, I'd found a course at the job center to do, and it basically talked about all the requirements and stuff, and I thought, well, I can do that. So, I went and did the course, passed it with flying colors, and then I started working security stuff, which I still did before COVID, of course. So we had the whole security thing going, and at the start of 2019, I started building the very PC that I'm using right now. I still use it. And building it over time and building it over budget and money and stuff like that, yeah, it was tough at times, because I'd saved money, and I thought, you know what, it was nice to do something for me. And even though it's not the best PC build around, it could definitely be upgraded. There's definitely things that could be better about it. It's mine. I did it by myself, and I was so proud of it when I came in. But when 2019 came around, I found it, like, impossible to stream in my head. Like, I would sit down at my desk here, and I would still go through, and I would set everything up Twitch-wise, and I'd met a bunch of people like Huddled Heracross before then, and Onage Galore, and various other people that, you know, I still talk to sometimes to this day, and they had all helped me out. And, you know, I'd been playing Draft League Pokemon and stuff like that, mostly like casual leagues with people I'd met online. And that was when I first met, like, people like Denistrio and various other people like that. And so I started playing. And, of course, you know, the rest is GPL history in that regard. The GPL sadly no more, but that was fun while it lasted. But I started streaming, and my first few streams back in May of 2019 were kind of bad. Not gonna lie, like, when I think about it now, it was kind of bad. I had, like, a really, like, rubbish background that was just basically a free background that I downloaded off of a YouTube video, and I just hue shifted for the game, I guess. Yeah, so that's when it all started. But that's when I met some of you guys. You know, Namarunya's been here from the get-go. You know, Huddled Heracross was there, Corrupted Nitro was there. There's a lot of people that I knew from the early days, some that are not with us anymore in terms of streaming. Some of them have quit streaming altogether. Some have just left Twitch. But I remember the day that I got affiliate because I got raided by 2 different people. I got raided by Celestro and Exclusives. Exclusives I still occasionally see around. Celestro I haven't seen much at all. I don't quite know what happened to him. But I got raided that day, and I went from having 2 people in my chat, which was basically a lurker. It was a friend of mine in call, or it was huddled occasionally, or it was someone else every now and then, and my next door neighbor who was lurking. And I suddenly had like 50 odd people in my chat. I was overwhelmed. I'm not gonna lie. Like, back then I was completely overwhelmed. But I ended up streaming for 12 hours that day. Because I'd held like 30 plus. I think I had 40 at one point. Throughout the whole thing. And that was the day I got affiliate, and when I realized that actually this journey meant something. And every time I would like want to stop streaming, or I'd want to cancel streaming, like Rosie would message me and be like, "You're doing really well. Seriously. Like, you are looking better and better by the day." And I loved it. I just loved being able to sit, play Pokemon, which is something that I love and enjoy doing, and just talk to people. And that was when I started joking around and everything like that. You guys know the story of how I got my name, so I don't need to talk about it here. But, it's just one of those things where, like, one thing led to another. I met people, and I met friends of friends and stuff like that, and we started building this up. And I finally came out of my shell. And that was the most rewarding feeling I ever had. Because, hell, I was depressed. You know, I tried to take my own life. And I really struggled to find anything that I enjoyed more than just playing video games. And the fact that people kept coming back, the fact that people kept talking to me, the fact that people enjoyed battling me or hanging out with me or just talking to me in general, I finally found the form I needed to actually be myself. And throughout the whole time, though, even despite all of the new friends I was making, the new followers I was making, I've met so many amazing people. And a lot of those are you guys, right? And it gave me strength that I didn't know I had. And even though I still struggle to look at the camera sometimes, I still don't necessarily believe in what I have. I moved into 2020 with a bit of a rough start. Despite all of the progress we'd made. We'd hit just about 200 followers by the start of New Year. And then, of course, we had the whole Pixelmon issue. I joined a Pixelmon server that became toxic very quickly. And I messed up. I promoted something that I should never have promoted. I did something that I didn't believe in. And I felt like I let you guys down. I felt like I let everybody down. And what compounded the problem back then was when I left. I think it was like mid-March, maybe late March, early April, that I left the Pixelmon server. That I needed something to get back to where we were. And that was when I started talking a lot more with Huddled Heracross. We did a Storm Silver Cage Lock together, which you guys loved. That was definitely one of the most fun playthroughs I've ever done, and I definitely want to do more of that at some point in the future. And at the same time, just after that Cage Lock happened, I had a phone call from Rosie. And it wasn't the same like phone calls that we used to have a lot of the time, where we were just like vent to each other, talk to each other. You know, she'd send me a selfie, I would send one back sometimes, although my face ain't nearly as good as hers was. And she told me that she was going to hospital. And I was worried, of course, because COVID had just taken hold. We'd just gone into a lockdown in the UK. And she wouldn't tell me what it was at the time. But it later transpired that it was COVID. And it was quite severe symptoms. So she was in like a COVID ward that we had at the time. And 3 days later, she passed away. And I was lost. You know, my best friend had gone. And I remember the day I found out that she'd passed away because her mom had phoned me. And had told me. And I just remember bawling my eyes out. Because all the time that she supported me, I always felt like I never did enough back. You know, I'm not gonna lie, I'm not proud of what I did next. And it was stupid. But after I kind of like not put myself back together again, I went to my local shop, I bought a whole box of paracetamol, and I ate the whole thing. I just downed the lot. I was very sick. I was not very well at all. And I was just grieving. But it was very quickly met with the response that I was able to meet so many amazing people. I was networking a lot. I was talking to people, and that's when we met Hermes Game Corner and Nerder King and all of that community, the Game Corner crew. And they were amazing. Like, Nerder King's responsible for this background and all the other visual background upgrades that he's done. And that was when we started to grow. But we'd gone from like 200 followers to like 500 very quickly. And we kept growing and growing and growing. And all the time, like, people would talk about all the amazing things I've done. You know, I'd support people all the time. I was always watching streams. In fact, I've even got streams on the side screen right now, right? And people would tell me a lot of things. And it was awesome to be praised, but I found it hard to accept. And I think I found it hard to accept because the only person that I ever, like, truly accepted praise from was Rosie, and she's gone. And, you know, I can't bring her back. And, you know, there are times today when I'll look at my phone and I just hope to see that selfie of hers again. And I know I get a little sad that it's not going to be there. But nowadays I can manage it. But it's not easy. But the more people that I met, the more people that threw support at me, as hard as it is for me to accept it, maybe I am that person. You know? And that was, I think, the biggest turning point for me was my birthday. Now, up until this year, I had never celebrated my birthday. I never saw a reason to celebrate my birthday. But it was people like Hermes and Nerder King and various others in the stream at the time that were persuading me to stream on my birthday. And, well, a lot of you guys who were there, you'll remember what happened. But I just remember within 10 minutes of that birthday stream, just crying my eyes out. And it sounds so stupid, but I didn't know how to feel. Like, people were throwing subs at me. Like, I had people like White Shadows in call with me at the time. You know, just reminding me of all the things I've done. The good things. And the positive things that I've done. And all that time, I was just so happy. And I think that was the first time I ever experienced, like, full happiness without restraint. And since then, we've gone on from strength to strength. We joined Nurko, you know, and I started, you know, bringing you guys into there. Hermes was the reason I joined Nurko, right? And, you know, I've met some amazing people along the way, people that I've never would have met otherwise, and it's just grown more and more and more. And I've never felt better. And, you know, even though Rosie's gone, even though she'll never see this, she's always been here. And it's without people like her, without people like the psychologist that's believed in me, without you guys, I'd be dead now. There's no two ways about it. And I'm so grateful for every one of you. Even if you just lurk in my stream or you just watch a video once in a while. That means so much. That I have a place. That I have value. And that's true for all of you. Alright? Every single one of you in here. I know I've got a lot of friends who struggle. And I know I've got a lot of friends who have sat in silence and don't know who to turn to. I want you all to know that I understand. I'm not perfect. No one is. But what I am is someone who cares. I tried telling myself I wouldn't get emotional telling this story, but I know I have to. Because at the end of this year, we're over 1,000 followers in. 1,000 people are following my Twitch channel right now. That's crazy. That's crazy to me. But it means so much. Like, all the amazing people I've done playthroughs with, like Huddled and Denistrio and Lady Ciora and, you know, Game of York, Tiny Togepi and Satchmo from Bad Skywars Gaming. You know, even like Moonlight Wolf. You know, all the co-streams I've done of Among Us with like Phoenix and Mr. Barnes and all of these guys. Like, it's mind-blowing to think how far we've come. And to think that it all could have been over at 10 years old. But man, am I glad it's not. So here we are. 2020. At the end. Moving into 2021. And I want to commit to myself here because I don't want to struggle anymore. I don't want to suffer anymore. I want to prove that this journey is possible. And no matter what happens, at the end of this year, I will be getting my mental health disorders reassessed. No matter what. And I want 2021 to be the year that we make a difference. I fought off COVID in 2020, and that broke me, but I got back up because of you guys. The amazing people that reached out to me, the DMs I had was flooded. I could not even answer them all. So many people give it down. That's hard to realize, but it makes me realize that I'm not a bad person. And there's so much more to come. You know, I want to break free of the shackles of the disorders that have broken me. I want to rise above them. Because I've been getting stronger for a while. And we're not where we want to be yet. And who knows, I may never accept myself as a good-looking guy. I may never accept myself as deserving of what I have. But I'm sure as hell grateful that I have it. And I want this to be a message to everyone that you don't need to sit in silence. I know this is a long video. I know I'm crying right now. And I don't care. But if you are struggling, if you are sitting there in silence, please speak up. I promise you, it's the best thing you could do. It's gonna be hard. But whether that's me, a family member, a friend, maybe a member of my Discord, please reach out. Because no one deserves to suffer. No one deserves to sit there in silence while life is breaking them apart. No one deserves that. And no matter how many times people bring you down, no matter how many times you're knocked down, get back up. Because you are worth that. As much as I wish that things were different, as much as I wish I could sit here now and preach the amazing things that I am, I need to believe that in myself first. And in order to do that, I need the amazing people in my life that are here. And I hope that no matter what happens here, in the next year or so, that we create even more amazing things. Playthroughs, making a difference to people, and just building some positive force in life. And I promise that I will do everything in my power to make sure that I can do this. I haven't given up. And no matter how many people I hurt, no matter how many times that people come and go, I know that I have incredible support around me. We will do this. We will get through this together. And that is my story. From 1992 to 2021. I have never told this story to anyone before. But you know what? Being able to talk about it now. Yes, I couldn't do it without getting emotional. But I can do it. Which means I have a voice now. It's time to use it. And I know that some people have watched this and will probably think less of me. And that's okay. Alright. I know I've probably worried some people. And that's okay. But I want you all to understand that you are all amazing. And I want you all to understand that this is me. I am the guy that cares. I'm the guy that laughs. I'm the guy that jokes. I'm the guy that can do a lot of things. But we can do so much more than that. So, let's welcome 2021 with a bang, shall we? And let's make 2021 the best possible year we can. As always, guys, now more than ever, thank you so much for watching. Stay safe. Stay awesome. I'll see you guys in 2021. Take care.